What's the craziest thing you heard or witnessed at a rich people event? Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. I was a server at a really nice restaurant and ended up working a dinner in our private room for the president of a major movie production studio's birthday. One of the guests at the dinner was apparently a major producer and insanely rich. I heard them discussing how he had decided to collect every bottle of a very nice winemaker's specific vintage. To put into context, this bottle would probably go for about $2,000 per in a restaurant. Not sure what retail would be, and had a full-time employee tracking down private collections and restaurant wine cellars that might have bottles. At that point, he had over 4,000 bottles of the one wine, organized by serial number in a custom-made cellar. He told a story about how Martin Scorsese had bad-mouthed a franchise he funded, and when he later called looking for funding for The Irishman, he told him to go fudge himself. At one point in the dinner, his assistant, one of 3 assistants sitting at the end of the long dinner table, informed him that the first truffles of the season had been delivered to some chef in Tokyo. So producer Guy goes, "Great, anyone want to go to Tokyo this weekend for a truffle tasting?" A couple of people said yes, so he instructed the assistant to make sure one of the jets is available for the trip. They stayed 3 hours after we closed, bought every bottle of the same brand of wine, different vintage, we had in our cellar for the road. Let me taste a 1989 Chateau Haute Brion, and tipped $3,600 for the lateness of their departure. Wild night. Edit. It wasn't Kevin Feige for those trying to guess. He wasn't American. Answer. A full-time employee tracking down private collections and restaurant wine cellars that might have bottles. He instructed the assistant to make sure one of the jets is available for the trip. This is what people rarely understand about the ultra-rich. They rarely do anything for themselves. Instead, they employ a whole company of people to sort out the logistics and details of whatever they want to do. Flying a bunch of people to Tokyo on a private jet probably didn't even faze the assistant. Story 2. My friend had a friend who was one of those crazy rich Asian type of dude. Watch the movie and you will know what I mean. One day, this rich dude was driving his Ferrari in the toll road. My friend was in another car following him for a car meetup event. This dude crashed his Ferrari to another car and then stopped in the side of the road. He went out, called someone, and waited while smoking with my friend. He acted like normal. Nothing happened, my friend said. In 10 minutes, suddenly there was a yellow Lamborghini came up. The Lambo driver went out, took the Ferrari key from the rich dude's hands, and then sit inside the crashed Ferrari. The rich dude drove the Lambo and continued the journey. Apparently, the new driver will take the fall for every single crash-related problem. Oh yeah, police was there the whole time, and they did not bother to talk or approaching the rich dude before the Lambo driver came up. Story 3. Learned about the yacht life. I once had super wealthy bosses, and they were talking about their friend who owned several buildings and who had a big yacht, so the yacht was always ready to go, which meant that it had a full complement of personnel, paid full time, down to chefs and servers. It was basically a hotel at sea. The thing is, the guy rarely used it. So you had a boatload of bored people who had nothing much to do. If the guy goes to Europe, he would rather fly there and have the yacht head there ahead, just in case he felt like using it, which wasn't all the time. Answer. One summer, I'm strolling the docks one night and come across this crowd in front of one yacht watching through the windows. So of course I got to check it out. One of the crew members was working on dressing a spray bottle of, I can't believe it's not butter, in some sort of doll costume. It's a memory so absurd that I sometimes question if I imagined it. Story 4. When we were poor, our daughter went to a private preschool that was great for her disability, and they accepted us at hardly any tuition in exchange for speaking at fundraising events for them on our daughter's benefit from being at the school. At their big fancy yearly ball dinner, we were speakers, and they sat us at a donor table. We were literally stealing dinner rolls to make our Carl Buddig sandwich meat better. At the auction portion, one of the ladies explained that last year she bid on and won the African safari, but she didn't have anyone to go with her, so she donated it back to this year's event. As that vacation came up for bid, she goes, "Wait, my niece loves animals and travel. I'll take her." And she went and bought it for a second year in a row. Answer. I would imagine being the scholarship kid at any private school would be a difficult experience. Sure, you're in a private Hogwarts-style high school that basically guarantees Ivy League admission for all its students, but your peers are taking the private jet to Bora Bora for Christmas, and you never have any money to participate in whatever it is they're doing. Story 5. I worked a private event as a waiter. It was a rehearsal dinner. The father of the bride was telling everyone he chartered a private jet for his daughter and son-in-law to fly to Bali for their 6-week honeymoon, which he has also paid for. The jet was to stay there for their use for the duration of the trip, in case they wanted to visit other places if they got bored. The rehearsal dinner for 20 people was about $20K. Working that event was probably the most I ever made in one night at that job. Certainly the easiest. Answer: a bar buddy was this rich trust fund dude, but he didn't dress rich. He had a nice apartment and was the type to cover the bar tabs. In my single days, he would say, "Hey, OP, you want to go to New Orleans?" He loved no, and I was broke. So my answer was always, I'm broke, so no LOL. But he would say, "No worries, I got you," and book a private jet for 5 to 8 of us. Dude was a good dude, but he loved his Ducati too much and unfortunately died from an accident. When one of our buddies got laid off and got behind on his mortgage payments, he paid off his past due and gave him money to survive for the next 6 months. Story 6, special service. It was a ritzy wedding, and someone there was a congressman. So we had secret service throughout the wedding, pretending like they were guests while also not engaging with anyone to be distracted. They were like real-life NPCs. Answer: if it was a congressperson, it would have been Capitol Police, and they only normally provide security to leadership or members who may have active threats against them. All 535 senators and congressmen do not have one or more security folks. So if like Pelosi was there, yeah, Capitol Police would be there. Secret Service protect executive branch and foreign diplomats. Story 7. I was in the Peace Corps in Zambia. We used to hang out at the casino in Lusaka because they gave you free food, drinks, and cigarettes while you played. We would play like 2 hands of blackjack just to get fed. But I went to the roulette table, and some guy put down 10,000 in USD all over the table, lost his spin, and just shrugged his shoulders and walked away. Coming from the village where we shat in holes and pumped our own water, I was floored by the amount of wealth that existed right around from us. Story 8. My buddy took me on a cruise with our local Ferrari club. The house we went to was owned by a member who had 8 Ferraris in his garage. At this house, he also had a real Michael Schumacher F1 car and a Ford GT. While we were there, he unveiled his new car, a custom-built Daytona SP3 that was all completely custom. The base price of the car is around $2.2 million, so with the customizations, it was closer to $3 million the way he had it. The crazy part was the story he told about it. This was supposed to be an early build number car, but it was delayed. He had to ask Ferrari about why his $3 million car was taking so long while he was putting in another order for a completely custom Ferrari that is probably worth even more than that. Spending more money on 2 cars than I'll probably make in my whole life was a pretty wild story to hear. While in a garage with cars that collectively are worth more than my family has made altogether for a couple of generations really puts the wealth gap into perspective. Answer: am the poor guy in my car club, buy a lot, and several of the people in it have car collections like you described. All of them are gracious and kind. Those that weren't are uninvited to the group. It is amazing to see the kind of money that people have to toss around. One guy's car was not running right, and he was going to cancel coming. One of the others sent an Uber for him to come to his place and drive his spare Lamborghini. It was wild. Story 9. Them speaking casually of high authority people, as if they are friends. It was expected that they knew each other, but the casuality got me unprepared. Answer: the CEO of my company came down to visit our office and took all the managers out to lunch. He asked for an update on projects going on, and one person mentioned having been stuck in limbo because of the state agency not getting us the approval. He asked if anyone had tried calling the governor. After he looked around and saw a table full of blank stares, he pulled his phone out and did just that. Apparently the governor is a buddy, and the situation was resolved the next day. Story 10. I was hired to be a photographer at a wedding. They had rented the venue at a very expensive vineyard. There was a mansion there, and as part of the deal, the bridal party got to stay at the mansion. The owner is almost never actually there. He lives in a big White House, if you know what I mean. I show up early the morning of the wedding and am greeted by the butler, who's more or less exactly like what you think, but younger and not English. Throughout the day, I was all over the mansion taking pictures. During a lull, I was chatting up the butler. The weird thing was that he said it's shift work, that there are basically 3 of them. Maybe another guy for filling in, I'm not sure. And it's 8-hour shifts. So I was asking, since wedding stuff is kind of seasonal and it gets cold here, like if I showed up at 2 a.m. in January, one of you would be here, all alone in the mansion, just knocking around on the odd chance the big guy shows up? And he was like, yeah, someone's always here. That just kind of blew my mind. Can you imagine just being the dude who sits alone in someone else's mansion, polishing the silver, waiting to see if they show up? 85 chance I'd let my guard down and they'd catch me running around in my boxers dry, humping the statues while blasting AC/DC or something. Story 11. I was invited to a corporate party in NYC. The party was at the Museum of Modern Art. They rented the museum for the evening. There was a caviar table you could go to and get as much caviar as you wanted. I was told that the caviar cost $5,000. This was in the early 90s. Answer. Museum parties are special. Someone rented out the one I work at for a private dinner. I found myself standing between two men who were in a bidding war for a townhouse on Fifth Avenue. One of them told me he knew who else was checking the place out because he'd paid a hot dog vendor to set up across the street and tell him whenever he saw someone going in or out. Story 12. Not at an event, but at my then 9-year-old son's friend's house. They were very wealthy, and it was the dad's birthday dinner. They were having Philly steak, seafood, etc. Their two sons were disgusted that, hey, we're having Philly steak again. And one threw his away, and the other huffed off to his room and demanded his dad, whose birthday it was, take him to get a pizza. Dad actually did, and my macaroni-eating kid sat there scoffing his steak and witnessing the majesty of life. Story 13. Hot tip for anyone that likes art. The best place to see art in places like New York? Auction houses. They change their art every month. Most of it will go into private collections and never be seen again, and they are free to visit. I've stood in a room at Sotheby's in NYC by myself with 5 or 6 Monets, probably 70, 80 million worth. But the two crazy things I've seen is you won't even find rich collectors there. They send their assistants. And one time I was at Sotheby's and they were auctioning off a bunch of Tiffany vases. Some assistant was checking them out, flipping them over, bare hands, just almost tossing them around like Soho cups. I was shocked. Answer. I used to play an online game where they had ultra-rare collectibles, launch rares, stuff like that. In the early days after server launch, those items were fairly cheap. But as time went by, people reached endgame and had nothing useful to spend their money on. They started buying those ultra-rare stuff. And as time went by, their worth just kept increasing simply because there isn't another copy of that item. So it's basically an investment. You could always find a buyer for it. Hold it for 2 years and its worth increases. Party hats in RuneScape, for example, or Pokemon cards. Same thing essentially. Ultra rich just plays same game in different league. I like to think it's same thing in our world with art. Their worth is only going to increase simply because there is only one Mona Lisa, for example. So it can be fairly safe way to hold value of your money too. Property is kind of similar too, especially in city centers. You ain't going to see new houses built nearby, so the existing ones are just going to increase in price as the city grows. Easy money if you are rich. Story 14. Having to chase someone down because they paid a power bill for a family in need at a charity event. It was $2,200. They wrote the check for $22,000, said they just heard wrong. Story 15. I don't think it qualifies as a rich people event, but my wife works for bank. And unless you are management at a bank, you don't make shoot. At her company holiday party a few years ago, the president of the bank comes out on the stage and starts shooting dollar bills out of an air cannon. The sight of a reasonable, wealthy head of a bank shooting dollars at his underpaid, the 17-hour employees that they then have to scramble on the floor in their evening wear to pick up turned my stomach. I don't know how a supposedly smart and successful person could be so tone deaf. It was gross. Story 16. I attended a rich person dinner in Bel Air. My girlfriend and I hardly knew anyone there, but slowly got the sense everyone there was wealthy. The house where the dinner was held was listed for $80 million on my Zillow app. At the actual dinner, I began to make small talk with the guy seated next to me. We started talking about traveling, and he said his friend recently raced with the Porsches in Germany. I looked at him and said, "Oh, you mean he raced Porsches in Germany? That's great." He looked at me confused and said, "No, he raced with the Porsche family," and rattled off a couple names of the Porsche heirs that apparently they were friendly with. Story 17. When I was in school, I got paid $20 to work silent auctions for fundraising events in NYC. Most of them were for private schools in Manhattan. I swiped a credit card for a woman who bid $25,000 for her 5-year-old to be principal for a day. Story 18. I used to work for a company that did AV production for rich people in the Hamptons. A client had an annual 4th of July party at his mansion that had all the features of rich people party house plus a yacht on the back deck. He wanted a separate sound system on the boat. I had the system controls inside the cabin, and at some point during the party, Someone had dumped out a literal mountain of cocaine on a glass table that I noticed notches cut out for lines. Like thousands of dollars or substances left out for whomever to use, without much care for who saw it or used it. Story 19. I was at a political fundraising dinner around 20 years ago. There were many affluent rich people there, but only one billionaire. At one point, I naively asked him why he didn't run for office. He laughed and looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Son, why would I be a politician when I can own one?" Fudge me up then. Nothing has changed. Story 20. I went to a famous person's birthday party in Beverly Hills. I won't say who it was, just in case. But when my girlfriend and I got there, we were escorted up his driveway in a golf cart. Security brought us into his front room, where there was a gold piano, and then they escorted us to the backyard. First thing I saw was a woman in lingerie in one of those big inflatable spheres floating in the pool, but that was just the side pool. We kept going to the main backyard where there were trapeze artists, more lingerie girls in the bigger pool, a cigar wrapping station, Topher Grace sitting by himself, didn't seem like he knew anyone there, and a big jazz band playing. It was the most Los Angeles thing I've ever done, and honestly didn't enjoy my time there. We left early because of how self-important everyone seemed. Story 21. Literally bowls of joints and cigarettes left out around the house in beautiful glass-blown bowls. A Molly bathroom to just hang out and take substances. An entire bar of top-shelf liquor with not one but 3 signature cocktails. 2 DJs for different vibes. Rich people know how to party. Answer, went to a party once when I was younger, not a rich person party, and my buddy had a bunch of substances and booze laid out. At the dining room table, formally laid out with all his mom's nice china filled with substances, with signs he handmade with a calligraphy set. Crystal glasses, and he even decanted the MD 2020 in Boone's Farm. Classical music playing in the background. You can feel rich even if you're not. Story 22. For anywhere, not me, but my friend worked catering at this fancy charity auction and said people were casually bidding $50K on a weekend trip like it was pocket change. The wildest part was when someone bid $20K on a bottle of wine just to immediately gift it to someone else at the table. Meanwhile, my friend was making minimum wage serving them and stressing about rent that month. Answer, was at a large Midwest U.S. gala event about a year ago, hosted by a famous comedian. They didn't auction items, just did a live auction-style bid rally. Who will commit to a $500 donation? That kind of thing. Almost every, if not all, the tables had someone pledge $10,000. That was impressive given the size of the crowd. What floored me, however, were the number of people who stood up when they asked who would donate $100,000. Dozens of people were in for that, and then more than a few more for much larger amounts. I appreciate why people like donating like this, and believe that many of them are doing it for sincere reasons versus simply just performative social flexing. But as a former low-income person who now has some money and insight into the tax breaks, other perks behind this type of giving, I wish wealthy Americans would just pay a more equitable share of taxes. Not even big, successful fundraisers like the one I attended can make up for what a lot of the people in that room are siphoning off with the convoluted U.S. tax code. Story 23. There's not a huge difference in lifestyle between 10 and 30 million. I literally had nothing to relate to. He's one of my best friends and the kindest guy you'd meet. He drives an older truck from the early 2000s and likes t-shirts and shorts. Answer, he's not terribly wrong. Granted, I am a regular middle-class guy without significant wealth, but it does make sense, especially if they live normal lives. People with 10 million and 30 are probably in generally the same state. They don't have to worry about money for typical expenses, housing, food, etc. They don't have to work as their net worth is enough to last them through any retirement scenario. They can travel, do fun things, etc. without thinking too much about how much things cost. That makes their lives a whole different thing than for, presumably, you and I who have to worry about those things every day. But they're not buying yachts, private jets, sports teams, or hiring rock stars to perform at private events either. The sorts of extravagances that you see people mentioning in this thread are things that they could afford exposure to, renting a private jet, etc., on rare occasions. But they couldn't do on a whim or have them be a fundamental part of their lifestyle. They can buy a house nicer than you and I will ever have, but they can't buy that 80 million mansion someone was talking about up thread or get one of the jets, etc. In this case, it's a matter of what's the difference between 10 million and a billion? And what's the difference between 30 million and a billion? The answer in both cases is pretty close to 1 billion. Despite the fact that to the rest of us, even the smaller numbers and the lifestyle they enable are unachievable. Story 24. I went to school with a lot of crazy rich kids, the richest of whom were normally Russian. A few stick out to me. It was a boarding school, so we had all our stuff there all term. At the end of term, one kid piled his stuff on the side of the road and got into an all-white Rolls Royce as it pulled up. As it left, a second all-white Rolls Royce pulled up and collected all his things. One of the nicest kids you'll ever meet decided he wasn't going to go into student accommodation at uni, so he decided to buy a house. I asked him out of interest how much money he had access to. His dad had given him $3.2 million in spending money to last him 5 years. We also had a designated helicopter landing pitch for anyone who flew in. Story 25. At a very rich people wedding, the groom's father talking about what a sound financial investment it was for this other rich girl to marry his son. To top it all off, the groom was 200 gay. Story 26. This is pretty subtle, but I was visiting someone and the conversation of middle-class tax cuts came up. Someone said, "Yes, I agree. I think that's exactly what they need." I've always heard absolutely everyone in my life identify as some form of middle or working class. I never heard someone use they as a pronoun with discussing the middle class because they recognized that they were way above it. Answer: I was raised poor in the South. I'm now middle class in San Francisco. There's a lot of rich people in San Francisco, and some of them are more accessible than usual because they run startup tech companies, like as a hobby. They then have employees and assistants and go to events with normal people. Several of my friends work for these startups. So in my life, I've probably heard people refer to the middle class as them, almost much as us, from both above and below. Story 27. I was once at an all-you-can-eat lobster dinner put on by a company as a reward for high-performing employees, and a tipsy millionaire started yelling at his bosses who were worth hundreds times more than him because the wine selection was subpar. I was once told to get my pilot license after complaining about being in a long-distance relationship. Story 28. Good friend of mine catered Zuckerberg's birthday party a while back, and the dude had an entire McDonald's with all the food, packaging, and such flown in to his fudge backyard. None of the cooks were McDonald's employees, but fine dining line chefs making Big Macs and other shoot, while the rest of them made all the real food for the sober adults. Story 29. Not a rich person event, but I was in the lobby waiting for job interview, and this guy who just graduated law school was finishing last day of internship or something, and they just offered him a job. He got a huge signing bonus, and they are paying him 4 weeks' salary to take a vacation before starting. That's just a different world than I'm used to. Story 30. Years and years ago, assisted a photographer at a fundraising event at the country club for a very, very, very private gated community in the NC Mountains. The turn into the entire community was all but disguised as a junky old mountain holler driveway. No signage, missed it the first 2 times. Absolutely grilled at the guardhouse before they let me through, and then about 30 years into driving up. Holy shoot. The Garden of Eden. It was wild how well hidden everything was. The event was at the country club, and there were some very famous names in attendance. It was my job to stand beside the photographer and write down the names of those in attendance as they lined up for their photo op with the famous names. During the dinner was upstairs inserting photos and polishing already immaculate solid sterling picture frames that had to have weighed a couple of pounds each, and then passing them off to a handful of staff with 1,000-yard stares to be arranged on tables by the doors upon exit after the event ended, then standing downstairs beside that table, checking names off a list as the donors' attendees left and were supposed to pick up their parting gift. Except it never really got that far because the sheer volume of people who saw their photos in those frames just tried to fudge steal them. Never mind that they were clearly intended as a donor gift, that part didn't even matter. I was hired help. I had nothing to do with anything except the expectation that I'd hand them off and check a name off a list, assuming that the event organizers had shared that information with the attendees' donors. I guess they didn't. People were literally swiping them and shoving them into their jackets, pockets, down pants, and or purses and hauling jerk for the door, while I stood there desperately trying to explain it's a gift. If you don't mind, what's your name so I may check it off that you received yours? That went down like a lead balloon. Apparently being told that something was intended as a gift after you already fudge stole, it was considered rude. Maybe you should have asked before you tried to shove it down your pants. I've witnessed wealth. I don't possess it, but I've been in the company of more than plenty and sometimes to the point of excess. But this was on a level of its own. These people collectively possessed more fudge you money than some small countries. but behaved no better than a flash mob on an Apple store in San Francisco. I've just never seen anything like it, before or since. Story 31. Not a gala or event. A friend's wife worked at an HOA in a rich area where some celebs and pro athletes lived. One resident asked her if the airplane pass overhead could be changed to avoid the area. They weren't even close to the airport, maybe 20 miles. Answer: they sorta did this in Newport Beach in Southern California. When you fly out of Orange County Airport, SNA, you take a more aggressive than normal takeoff pitch, and then the pilot will throttle back over the noise-sensitive community and let the plane glide until hitting the ocean and powering back up. Sometimes the pilot warns the plane, but if not, it can make for an interesting first time flying out for passengers. Story 32. My dad cooked a small dinner at a very privately wealthy family's house, in which male body part Cheney was a guest, and they flew in Elton John to play piano for the night. That same family put on a birthday party for their 4-year-old granddaughter, who wanted a carnival for her birthday, so they invited all of the country club staff's families to make the place look alive. Free carnival rides and food all day and night in their backyard. Story 33. In 2017, Jim Crane brought his newly won World Series trophy to a museum event in Houston, and a tipsy millionaire knocked it over, breaking it. They called the museum conservation staff in after hours and fixed it, but shoot was tense. Story 34. I worked in catering while in law school. Worked a super rich family's daughter's wedding where the dessert course was a whole show. A giant ice sculpture of a dove was carted out, probably 10 ft high. In the middle there was a giant gold ball. Once it got set, they pushed 2 racks of glasses up next to the sculpture on opposing sides. Then 2 guys with chrome bore drills drilled into the sides of the sculpture, and desert wine came pouring out of the internal globe into the waiting glasses. According to the wedding planner, the sculpture was $15K. The wine in the sculpture was close to $50K. Story 35. I worked at the Montage Resort in Laguna Beach, CCA. A centimillionaire threw a birthday party for himself. He hired John Legend and Don Henley to put on a show for him. Henley cost $750K for a couple songs, and John Legend was $250K. Story 36. Car dealership owner celebrated his wife's birthday with a 20-person dinner. The entertainment was Joan Osborne, What If God Was One of Us. Weirdest event I have ever done sound for. Story 37. Through some odd connections, I found myself at a private dinner that included the then current treasurer of a U.S. state. This was decades ago. His wife was young and gorgeous, and everyone, not me, was drinking steadily. As the night wore on, the state treasurer demonstrated his ability to touch the tip of his nose with his tongue, and my connection, the one who got me invited, said, "That's why he always has a beautiful blonde in his arm." Raucous laughter all around. Later I said something to my connection about the treasurer's wife, and they laughed, rolled their eyes and said, "That's not his wife, that's his girlfriend." Well, one of them. After further discussion, it was revealed that every woman there was either a side piece or casual open thing, and most of the men, all VIP drink, had wives at home. Meanwhile, I was from a small coastal Gulf of Mexico fishing village, and this was the kind of thing I only saw watching Dallas. Tame by current standards, but back then it was scandalous. Story 38. I used to work for an eye doctor, and he sent me to a charity event in town. There was a silent auction, the kind where you write your bids down, and someone would come behind you and bid a little more. The doctor asked me to bid on this ski package and gave me a blank check and a maximum price. As dinner finished and the auction began, I knew that I was in the wrong room. I decided that instead of hanging around the ski package, I would just write down the maximum and hit up the open bar. It wasn't my money. As I was backing away from the table, the guy behind me was a local developer. Big real estate, big money. He looked at what I wrote down, looked at me and said, "There is no way you have that kind of money, and I bet that you don't even ski." He then turned around, wrote 10K as a bid, and looked at me and said, "You ruined my fun." I think IF will ruin everyone else's fun. He walked around the room and bid 5 to 10K on all of the luxury items. The charity broke a fundraising record, but people were pissed. I could care less. When I told the doctor the story, he thought it was funny. Answer. My mom once told me about auctions that the third best thing you can have at any auction is a rich guy in the room. The second best thing is have 2 rich guys. The best is 3. That's all you need. I watched my friend's dad bid $1,000 and win a chocolate cake at a public school band fundraiser just because he wanted it for his table and to share with everyone. Not a huge dollar amount, but he got in a bidding war with someone else who tapped out at $950. Should add that my friend's dad was very rich, like early Microsoft money. Story 39. Remember when the pictures came out of Prince Harry partying in Vegas? This was years ago, but they were everywhere. My coworker's wife was in the background of several. My coworker didn't even know she was in the same city. Story 40. I worked at a summer camp for really rich foreign teens. I'll probably make an AMA about it soon. There was a group of Muslim kids from one of the Stan countries that were probably the highest average net worth out of all of the nationalities there. One claimed to be the grandson of one of their presidents, and another said his dad owned their top oil companies. Anyway, the second kid said that he was big into ladyboys and that his dad was too. He said something along the lines of his dad had taken him to gentlemen's clubs when he was younger. That was just insane and showed me that these rich foreign kids are into some crazy shoot, even despite their superficial religious background. Story 41. Worked for a guy who said he shouldn't have to pay taxes because he doesn't use the welfare programs it pays for. I get where he comes from, but taxes pay for so much more than just welfare. Same guy also said that he lies on his taxes because if he gets audited, then hell, just pay what he owes. But if he doesn't, then it's free money. Answer. I worked retail right when Amazon was getting really big. Unlike today, it used to be the case that you didn't pay tax on Amazon goods. The guy comes in to price match Amazon. No problem. What we do is mark down the subtotal so that when tax is added, it comes out to what Amazon's price would be. For example, if Amazon is selling something at 100, we would sell it for 91.92 or whatever tax added to be 100. This guy was furious, saying that he doesn't pay taxes. Oh, sir, I think you are misunderstanding. You are not paying for taxes. The total is X. No, I see it right there on the screen. The subtotal is X and the total is Y. Yes, I guess you are technically paying tax, but it is the same exact price as Amazon. But I just told you, I don't pay taxes. I genuinely thought he was confused, and then I realized he doesn't even want the principle of paying taxes to be on this receipt. The guy didn't buy what he came in for that day. Story 42. Worked as a subcontractor on a job in CA. Owner invited me and other guys to the opening party. The owner had a T-Rex skull in the basement. It was super cool, lit up like a futuristic Jurassic Park movie. Party gets going and the guy invites us to do some blow. Before we get in the room, he takes a nail file and shaves off some of a main tooth on the inside of the skull so you couldn't see the damage. I look at him like he's insane. He looks back and just goes, "Dude, Dino bumps." Not gonna lie, it was kinda awesome. Story 43. I work at a high-end country club. It was raining, so we closed the tennis pickleball basketball courts. A group of teens came in and asked if they could play basketball. When I told them the court was wet and slippery and they weren't allowed to play, one kid said, "There are towels in the locker room. Grab some and go dry it off." It was pouring rain when he said this. Answer, it's a tricky situation, and depending on the club, they'd probably just let it go. But I know some high-end clubs that would not tolerate that at all. That's worth a call to the principal's office. You just have to be careful. I know a guy who ran one of the most exclusive clubs in the US, bar manager, and he got fired because he had to cut off a guest at a member guest tournament. He said he'd done similar things many times, but he did it to the wrong guest. The entire front of house staff quit immediately, so they had to shut down bar service for about a week. Story 44. I worked for a millionaire in Hollywood who needed someone to scrub footage from an old film they didn't want to see the light of day. It was the millionaire, old dude, and a woman in her mid to late 30s, actress. They were always together and he kept trying to get her acting roles, but she sucked. No one really knew what their relationship was, but people gossiped. When I was scrubbing footage, I was working inside his house and she was always there, but didn't live there. Then one day her dad came over to visit and he constantly spoke to her in a weird baby voice, even though she was in her mid-30s. The millionaire was also older than her dad. So then I started to suspect that she was his sugar baby. But one day I was snooping around and found a daily diary of hers. And she wrote in several pages how she wanted to find her dream man and prayed for the one to show up in her life. So, not her boyfriend and not her dad. I still don't know to this day what they were to each other because they weren't related by blood. I did, however, convince them that the job cost $500 a day and milked it for a week or two. Story 45. So I've talked about this before on Reddit. My fiance's family are rich. Like if you live in the local area, you've likely heard their names Rich. If you know what industry they made most of their money in, you'd probably know of them. Not billionaires, but rich enough that multiple generations of her family would never have to work again if they just stopped tomorrow. We're in the UK. It's important for the story to mention that she is white and I am not. Her family are actually really nice, lovely people, but the rich people events I get invited to are full of literal, stupidly evil people. Like if they had the capability, these cunts would be supervillains. They casually discuss how great fox hunting is, refer to normal people as the help, make jokes about peasants, etc. The weirdest thing, however, is they sometimes literally have these conversations, like the ones you'd see in Get Out. Answer: I've had the same in the UK. When I first met my GF, she was doing well, but some of her longtime friends had hundreds of millions, or owned 300 HMOs in a seaside resort. I have never heard as many conversations as with them meanie about tax law. And I have never wanted to punch somebody as much as one of them, thinking it was acceptable to physically touch her then 19-year-old daughter as she got up from the table. Story 46. Eating sushi off super hot naked girls. I was tending bar at a party at a $50 million mansion in East Hampton. If I named the owner host, you'd all know who it was. There were movie stars and musicians there. There was a lot of crazy shoot there. What made the sushi thing so weird is nobody really paid any attention to the woman. It actually creeped me out and reinforced how different really rich people are. Story 47. I work for a company that provides a platform to host auctions, so I've been to a lot of these type of events here in the Northeast. I'll never forget what happened at this one event for a ritzy private school. During the live auction for a yacht trip around France, Paris, or something of the sorts, this one woman, who I guess helped secure the package or had friends who donated it, was not happy with the bid price that was going to win, basically saw it as an insult. She got up on stage, bitched everyone out, then said, "Fine, if you all won't spend the right amount, I'll do it." Lady spent $60K on the trip out of spite, walked off stage, grabbed her purse, and just walked out. Story 48. I used to wash boats and rich folk cars. One client bought his 13-year-old son a plane so he could race him home in the McLaren. As you do like. Story 49. Not exactly an event, but I'm working on a side television gig right now. When the owner who hired me came into town to meet me, I found out that he had flown into the private airport, meaning he spent between 30–70K, according to Google, on his flight. He fudged up by telling me this because we hadn't fully agreed to pricing on everything yet. I'd later get him to pay me $5,000 to cut a trailer that took me one day, also getting $5,000 per episode, but the money I made from that little trailer was sweet. Story 50. I worked one of the top 10 billionaires' weddings. It was a 3-day event. He flew his private wine collection out on his private jet that cost around $30K just for the wine. The flowers alone were $1 million. They had a live band till 11 p.m., and then a pretty famous DJ rose up from the floor and played till 3 a.m. The wedding total cost easily over $3 million. Worked a bar mitzvah, and he flew everyone out in his private jet. Had a professional cowboy hat maker there to make hats for everyone. Had a live band, and had at 10 p.m. the kids all left, and he brought in a plant substance dispensary with any and everything for anyone to partake. That cost over $2 million. Both tipped like shoot, and both are shoot humans. Story 51. Not as out there as some of these others. Went to a New Year's Eve party with a lady I was seeing who runs in pretty high international political circles. She works for one of the larger defense contractors. So it was pretty ritzy. Definitely a lot of cash splashing around. I think my date was wearing a solid $15K in dress and jewels. Definitely hijinks in the boots and bathrooms. I may be bred from illiterate cannon fodder stock, but I've drank from the golden cup, eaten from the silver spoon, etc., before so I can fit in for a New Year's party. But when one of my date's friends admonished the party for having the same ice sculpture fountain from last year for the Aperol Spritz, I didn't know how to respond because I know a guillotine joke wouldn't stick the landing with those bourgeoisie fudge. Story 52. My uncle is a concierge at the Pitkin County Airport in Colorado. He found a briefcase someone left on a plane with $20,000 cash, knew the person, and called them to come back pick it up. Who forgets $20,000 cash? My uncle also gets dibs on lost found items, so I make requests for gifts. So far, I've gotten a pair of Ray-Ban aviator sunglasses and Sony Bose noise-canceling sport earbuds. Story 53. Worked with a company where I got in with the rich exes and high-level directors working there even though I was an IC and was poor, making under 6 figures. I hung out with them after hours regularly, and I saw all kinds of crazy stuff. At one point, we got a new office, including a state-of-the-art audio space, control room, hangout space, and session rooms. The space was massive, easily able to comfortably accommodate 12 people, completely soundproofed with the top-end, best-of-the-best equipment for voice actor recording, sound mixing, and even playing and recording several instruments, and it was all floating. Essentially meaning that it was a room within a room. One of the people I worked with had a hobby for sound mixing, and started asking the audio team a lot of questions about how the room was set up, what brands the equipment cost, etc. I remember some of the hardware was worth something like $450,000 each. About 6 weeks later, the person asking all the questions casually told me that they had their people expedite the process of expanding their mansion so that he could have the same setup, floating room with the same hardware, costing him well over $1 million, just to play with as a hobbyist in his spare time. Story 54. A friend of mine in college came from a wealthy, abusive family. We all graduated at the same time. I was able to attend her family-thrown graduation party in her hometown, presumably as a guest, and her mother immediately put me to work as a cater waiter, working the room with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. I was from a very poor family in comparison, and her mother knew it. It was more humiliating than crazy. Story 55. I was once dealing blackjack in the high-stakes area of a large casino. 2 guys betting between $50K and $15K per hand. One guy lost all his money and says to his buddy, "Hey, loan me $50K. Second guy hands him $50K in chips and says, "Remember, you owe me $150K. This happened a few times in the half hour I dealt that table. Story 56. So anyway, I had to buy the maid a $1 million house so she could live closer to me to do my cleaning every day. And now she's not my maid anymore. Gee, I wonder why. How I wish I was joking. Story 57. I was at a wedding with loads of rich Americans once. First one I spoke to said they fly to Rome 3 times a year for shopping, and that this time they bought their 3-year-old daughter 4 designer bags. Second one I spoke to was stood with his 8-year-old son, who told me they'd just been to Africa and spent $200K shooting lions. 8-year-old kid with videos on his phone proudly showing me. Was a wild wedding. Story 58. I was at a party in New Orleans, and I saw a shiny object out of the corner of my eye. Upon speaking to the person who possessed the shiny object, I found out it was one of the biggest yellow diamonds in existence, or an expensive diamond beyond compare. Yeah, whatever. It was her next statement that drew my undivided attention. She said, "I shot my husband dead one night after I found out he was having an affair with another man. The judge gave me 6 years in a psych ward, but let me keep the ring." That was the moment I realized I was chatting with a murderer. Story 59. The piles of cocaine in the lodge bathroom at my wife's company's Christmas party. Whole thing felt like I was in a Wolves of Wall Street scene. Story 60. Went to a wedding in San Francisco 30 years ago. My wife was good friends with the groom. Lots of nice people that I'd never met. Casual conversation with anonymous attendee. He asked me what I do professionally. I tell him that I'm a public employee union advocate. He tells me I'm the problem with the world and turns his back to me. Similar thing happened to me when a mutual friend introduced me to Reince Priebus. In both instances, tell me you're a class warrior on the wrong side of the battle without telling me. The rich don't care about being polite or getting along. They drive the steamrollers. Story 61. Perhaps not heard but experienced. I'm a regular guy who has been clean and sober for 26 years. I live in a very high cost of living area about 90 miles up the 101 from LA. A fellow friend of Bill happened to be, and still is, rather a big deal in the entertainment industry. He would no longer have very large, very opulent Christmas parties peppered with mostly entertainment folks. Some in front of the camera and others behind. Others, like myself, are regular people who happen to have a friend who exists in an extraordinary situation. In any event, at one of the Christmas parties, I and my date got up from the table to go to the dessert station. It took a few minutes before we went back to our seats. As soon as we got near the table, I was furious. Some lady had taken my seat. I didn't leave a jacket, but thought my clearly full beverage and gift bag were sufficient notice. I approached the table 100 ready to talk some shoot. As I neared, the lady looked familiar. I scanned my mind as to where I knew her from. About 2 seconds later, she spoke, and I knew it was Nicole Kidman. I am not one to get starstruck in general. However, I suggested to my date that we find another table, while she whispered, "Was that Nicole Kidman and her new guy in our seats?" into my ear. I am not wealthy and will not likely ever be famous. I have learned in knowing a small handful of either rich, famous, or rich and famous people that beyond the basics being covered, it doesn't make anyone happy or fulfilled. One friend said, "I have been depressed and rich and depressed and poor. Between the two, I would choose depressed and rich." Story 62. There should be a line at the DMV for people like us, then another line for everyone else. For context, he's a super rich lawyer that thinks laws and mores don't apply to him and others of his status. Story 63. Worked as a lighting tech for events. One of my jobs was for a wedding that cost over $600K for the night. Most beautiful wedding you'll ever see. The groom had just finished his mother-son dance, and promptly left the dance floor. He was found outside throwing up and passed out on the side of the yacht club. 3 hours into his wedding, he was done. He missed the remaining 4 hours of his own wedding, which is a very expensive nap. Guy had to be in the doghouse for the next 2 years. Story 64. Went to an office Christmas party with my SO at the time. One of the C-suite daughters literally said, "My dad is so rich, I would fudge him if he wasn't my dad." Story 65. I once celebrated New Year's Eve at the big house of a rich family. He was the boyfriend of my girl's college roommate. Met the guy before, and he was really friendly. When outside for a smoke with his best friend, he told me the guy was gifted a small castle with 12 permanent staff for his 21st B-Day. Story 66. Not an event, but a rich people's summer club. A summer club is like a summer camp, but rich people own it, and everything is much better. At this summer club, each member owned the cabin, and the club as a whole owned all the land. There was a golf course, tennis courts, fishing lakes, and shooting range. As older members passed away, sometimes their cabin would get sold because their kids didn't want it. Even though this was a rich person's club, the cabins were fairly modest as the club wanted to keep the North Woods feel to the place. Rich people like nothing better than pretending they're normal sometimes. So an old cabin was sold, and for some reason, money, the club allowed the new owner to tear it down and build a new cabin. Except this cabin was a 2-story with a basement, 8-bedroom, 6-bath, 5,000 SQ foot monstrosity. The entire year that cabin was being built, the club members were abuzz with both haters and supporters of the new cabin. Finally, it was finished. The only thing left was the inspections by the county and state. The county did the normal new build inspection to make sure the cabin was up to code. No problems there. The state? Well, the state in this case was the Department of Natural Resources. Since the cabin was on a lake, the DNR had to approve the location of the cabin to make sure it followed DNR guidelines for building on a lake. This was the fun part. Everyone knew the new owner had been told how far away from the lake he needed to build. Of course, he ignored those guidelines and built that cabin where he wanted it. Sure enough, it failed the DNR inspection because that darn cabin was no more than 10 feet from the lake. So the DNR made him move the cabin 200 feet further from the lake. We all wondered how the hell he was going to do that. We watched a construction company come in and start digging a new basement. Once that was done, a house moving company came and picked that darn cabin up and moved it 200 feet over the new basement. Then another company came, filled in the old basement, and restored the land to a more natural state. Honestly, if I hadn't seen it, I would not have known the cabin hadn't been built on the second spot. People said the guy spent between $200,000 to $300,000 to move that cabin, and he wasn't even the richest guy at the summer club. Story 67. I watched a half-naked Al Jurgensen yelling random phrases in Spanish at a Wax Trax record staff party. Story 68. Go where the rich and the powerful are, I'd tell him, and learn their ways. They can be flattered and they can be scared. Please them enormously or scare them enormously, and one moonless night they will put their fingers to their lips, warning you not to make a sound, and they will lead you through the dark to the widest, deepest river of wealth ever known to man. You'll be shown your place on the riverbank and handed a bucket all your own. Slurp as much as you want, but try to keep the racket of your slurping down. A poor man might hear, Kurt Vonnegut, God bless you, Mr. Rosewater. This thread is a really good reminder of just how deep that river is. Story 69. Very pricey political fundraiser in NYC. The former police commissioner of NYC said from the podium that the then recent graffiti on the Christopher Columbus statue was proof that discrimination against Italian Americans was alive and well in the U.S. This got applause. To this day, this is the most WTF thing I've ever heard someone say with a straight face. Story 70. Private jet sent from Las Vegas back to the Bay Area to pick up leftover brisket from a party hosted by someone in the VC world. Story 71. Apparently there's underground skeet shooting events where people bet $100K per round. I heard about this at an energy industry skeet shooting event. Story 72. Roommate sports teammate in college got married. They flew me in to be a groomsman. I knew he had money, but not whatever the fudge I want money. Dad came up to me bragging about hiring a 30-person black choir to sing with him at the dinner after wedding. He really did, and Fudge danced and sang his jerk off. Then he caught me in the walk-in portable semi-truck-sized fridge. I found the Dom Perignon and had never had any, but always heard about it. He hands me 3 cases one at a time and said, get out there and start a Dom fight. So I did. Then he introduced me to the 2 state senators and the owner of the Chicago Bears. I drunkenly got to talking with the wedding planner and asked how much. $1.5 million. I was the quirky white trash friend who stopped people from bothering him or fought while he left the bar because of some jerk losing money on him in college. I woke up hungover in their fudge palatial mansion to a maid putting breakfast on my bed and asking if I, Mr. Southern Jeb, needing anything further, orders of magnitude greater wealth than anything I could have imagined. Go Gators! Story 73. My freshman move into the dorm at college. One of my classmates happened to be the daughter of National Basketball League coach. They rolled up in a limo with movers. It was crazy. Everyone else was having the Bug Me crew unload their boxes from the back of their parents' cars. Story 74. I am a teacher at a public school in a very wealthy area. At the Parent Social fundraiser gala, the PTA auctioned off a parking spot for $30,000 for 1 year. Story 75. I get to help plan these parties sometimes. I get a kick out of the assholes that try to one-up each other based on which helicopter they arrive in. Story 76. I was bartending, and this mid to late 60-year-old lady was telling me that her and her husband just built a house for themselves that is 38,000 square feet. Story 77. Not me, but my parents. They were on their honeymoon in the Bahamas. They met an Argentina couple who was on month 3 of their 6-month honeymoon. She spoke fluent English. He spoke broken English. At one point, he asked my dad, "How do you say I play windsurfing on my private pond?" Story 78. My husband went from roofing to fast food store management, hospitality, to working in a corporate business development role at a private equity firm. He overheard his office managers at work talking about how disgusting hospitality workers are a few weeks ago. He left that experience off his resume, but it was absolutely disgusting to hear people talking like that. He said another time his same office manager refused to get on the elevator with the maintenance people and stood there to wait for the elevator to come back, looked right at him and said, "Ugh, I'm not riding the elevator with dirty people. Some people are so cunty and out of touch." One of their attorneys was talking about casually dating a state senator, and on another occasion, he overheard him talking about how his buddy brags about his new private jet, but literally everyone has one. He's not that special. Story 79. Worked with a guy who used to be a deckhand on yachts for hire by rich dudes. The yacht got hired out by some rich Saudis, he didn't say who, and one evening, the yacht docked somewhere in Italy so they could go off and have dinner. A few hours later, one of them comes back and asks this guy to summon the captain. Gets the captain out of bed and is told, "One of the gentlemen has purchased a Zonda. Very, very expensive hypercar for those who don't know. Please arrange for it to be delivered back home." So the captain had to arrange delivery of this extremely expensive hypercar back to wherever he was from, and that came from whatever the hire fees were for the yacht that week. Then a few days later, they stopped somewhere else, and a bunch of ladies were brought onto the yacht. He implied that they were probably intimacy workers, but didn't say it out loud. He was legally forbidden from disclosing what happened next. Story 80. Person freaking out at the win after finally arriving because his private plane had to taxi for 1 hour after landing. Vegas Airport wasn't prepared for the influx of private planes at its first F1 event 2 hours ago. Story 81. I dislike being late to the party, but I was invited to a Sports Booster alumni fundraiser for a college. They get their friends to give $10,000 to the college football team in exchange for club seats and booze that acts as a bonus business tax expense write-off. That's the backstory. Here's the fudge-up part. One of the night activities was a dinner and an entrepreneur brainstorming session for the club where they would take all of these rich assholes in one room, get them all tipsy, and then see what business ideas they could come up with to make the club even more money. Over the course of an hour or so, these business owners came up with ideas for absolutely diabolical scams. One scheme included sending fake bills that the recipient would just pay because it would be too much work to question it. I remember there were employees for a catering company who were in the room working late at 10 p.m. at night, and the look of fudge disgust on their faces is something you'll never forget. Story 82. Not an event, but I once worked at a big music store. Mostly sell stuff online over the phone, but they also have a huge main location. Probably once or twice a week, some band musician will come in for a tour or to do media stuff, which leads to some stories being spread around by employees. I guess there was a time that Joe Walsh came into the store area with all the guitars on the wall and basically just walked around the room pointing at different guitars going, "That one, that one, that one," like he was picking out candy bars. No idea how many he actually left with though. For additional context, most of the guitars in that room were over 1,000 with some in the 5 figures. Story 83. I was invited once to a party with very rich people here in Mexico City. Nothing too crazy, but a guy was casually talking about his new island near Canson Lake. It was nothing. Story 84. Gonna be cryptic because reasons. Ended up at a small dinner with some real estate developers. Big time guys, international big time. They were talking about their employees, and one mentioned a guy whose dad wanted him to take on the family business, but he offered the guy 6 figures to find himself and then come work for him. Another mentioned a guy that left them to run a massive project in the Middle East. My takeaway was 1. Most of it sounded like a game to them. They wanted to win but didn't really seem to take stuff personally. 2. Anything they were discussing was a dream the average person would cut their arm off to possess. Story 85. I was catering a Rolls-Royce event in a penthouse and was serving canapes next to a setup selling private jets. Lots of people were genuinely interested. Also, a lot of people fawning over the Real Housewives in attendance. Story 86. I went to a gala for a rich private school, and they got Jim Caviezel, played Jesus in The Passion of the Christ, to talk, and I wish to God I still had the illegally recorded recording of his talk. He started by asking everyone to turn off their phones and not record, because what he was going to say here today had never been said anywhere else and was going to change the world. So of course, I immediately started recording. Long story short, he literally thinks he's Jesus. He got struck by lightning multiple times while filming, and I honestly can remember the rest of the manic ramblings, but he straight up thinks he's Jesus. Story 87. I was stuck in traffic, leaving said event, and one of the peeps was flipping out and yelling to fly in a helicopter to take them back to the city. Story 88. My lecturer once told me that Dang Nguyen Vu, the founder of Trung Nguyen Coffee, tipped him $250 USD in 2007 for treating him like a normal person. $250 USD was a lot, at least for a Vietnamese and FB waiter. Story 89. I heard one time at a charity gala, a billionaire literally argued with the staff about the temperature of his water. Like, how out of touch can you be? Answer. Because of my job, I've gotten to be part of some wild experiences. Your story reminded me of sitting with and listening to a group of bonkers rich folk complain about their service staff and chefs on their multi-100-foot yachts. The trite annoyances they went on about almost broke my brain. Your water story sounds right on par. They are completely out of touch. They can begin to empathize with normal people when they are living at that altitude. Like when you're furious because once your jet has landed, you can't immediately take the helicopter to your yacht because of the wind. You are not connecting with the rest of humanity on any level. Story 90. Hanging out in a ski lodge bar with a bunch of millionaires. The big argument was how you use toilet paper, bunched or folded. They got serious about it. Story 91. Truckloads of real snow brought in for a Christmas party in Texas, along with a team of real reindeer, real Santa, a dessert mountain, exactly what it sounds like, a wax sculptor, Elvis impersonator, caricature artist, a whole roasted pig, complete wapple in its mouth, and so much more, all at the same party. And the family did this every year. Story 92. I was once a babysitter for a rich dude's kid. A lot of sad stuff happened, and the kid and the mother died, but the guy married again. At his wedding, there was a show with jets making marks on the sky. A nationally known musician made music, and there was a huge firework. It was the driest summer ever, and fire in any form was strictly forbidden. The fireworks started a fire and half his company burned down. The only reason it didn't end up way worse was because the size of the fire was so huge. Firefighters from nearby counties came by because they saw fire and smoke on the horizon. And there was already firefighters present who quickly called for help. The fire escalated so quickly, before they could properly start to extinguish, the fire engine started to melt. Story 93. As a gift, when my wife and I were first engaged, a friend of ours paid for us to go have a fancy meal at a 5-star restaurant. We were 2 young kids, way out of our league, and opposite us were a bunch of older guys who spent the entire dinner one-upping each other about the size of their yachts, the various amenities on their yachts, and their yacht's crew. Naturally, each man considered his crew to be the best. In fairness to them, they were very nice and welcoming to us, and then went back to their yachting discussion. We ate what turned out to be a fairly mediocre roast lamb and raw vegetables meal, but the wine was excellent, so we got pretty merry on that, and then had an excellent dessert. The sideshow of bragging old guys more than made up for it. Story 94. Slum tourism. My boss is quite wealthy. When we have business partners over, he likes to invite some of the staff he personally likes to dinner. 2 years ago, some of our business partners talked about how they love vacations to South America, East Asia, and Africa, and how they hired personal guards to visit local slums. They talked about how fascinating it is that the locals live with 10 people and 2 mowers without water or electricity. Talked about how threatened they felt by all the poor people and how glad they were to find cheap armed guards for their excursions. I was shocked at first, and then the shock turned into disgust. TBH, I didn't say anything back then because I didn't want to offend my boss. He seemed disgusted as well, though, since he sees traveling around the globe as a privilege that should be used to learn about the local culture. Story 95. At a very wealthy family wedding, I witnessed the groom confessing his love to his best man's wife, who was a bridesmaid. She also said she would leave her husband, but he explained he couldn't inherit his family money. She later explained that if he didn't marry by a certain age and have a biological child by a different age with a wife that had not been married previous, he would lose a lot of money. She cried in my car while she told me. It was both startling and heartbreaking because they had lived each other for 10 years. Story 96. My brother worked major fireworks shows for a company. One year, he asked me to help him run a private show for a billionaire. We drive out to the property and can only talk to the ranch manager. It was one of 4 properties the family owned, all 10 40,000 acres. I was joking with the ranch manager about how big the properties are. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. If you'd like to see more content like this, you might be interested to know that I've created another channel with a similar theme, especially for those of you who enjoy what I do. I'll leave a link in the description, and I hope to see you there. Take care.